You could have died quietly. That's not a good look on you, Eli. You stay behind me.
I stand with you. Side is where we belong.
Red Mesa, Arizona Territory, the 3rd of March, 1879. They hung him for leaving the outlaws. But a Navajo woman cut him down, and he loved her with a honor no man had shown. The wind cut like iron filings. It rasped along the flats, found every seam in my coat, and made a saw of the barbed wire I was testing along the south line. I had both hands in a habit older than my name: glove, staple, pull, set, when the land offered up something that didn't belong to it. Not a horned toad or a tuft of rabbit fur snagged on wire. A glint, a buckle where no rider should have been, winking from the cholla like a bad thought. I kept working. Men who keep working live longer. That's a rule the West writes in dust and bleached bone. But I listened different. The fence hummed in the wind, the posts creaked. A far crow scolded the day. Beneath it, lower, I heard leather shift against bark and the slow, patient breath of a man who thought himself air. I turned my head no more than a thumb's width, the way a cattleman checks weather without letting it know he's worried. The horizon was a straight razor. The sun flashed along it. I tasted metal. I didn't look up again. The first blow buckled my knee. The second turned noon into 1,000 black seeds. I remember teeth against grit and the iron smell inside my own mouth. Then rope. A loop bit my ankles. The world tipped. Sky filled my eyes like cold tin. The wind had a different song, upside down thin, whistled through cottonwood floss, almost gentle if not for the knot chewing my skin. I swung. Boots above me. 3 pairs. A laugh that made a poor substitute for courage. Someone said, "Hang him high enough the coyotes can only watch." They hauled me up another yard. Blood pounded into my skull. My hat fell. I watched it spin to earth and land crown, first like a grave marker. The rope settled. Bark scraped my calves. A sparrow burst from a fork and stitched the blue with panic. They left a signboard nailed into the cottonwood, a rough brand of the outfit I'd run with before I learned better. A relic of my past life, hammered to the tree like a sermon. "Let him teach the others," the tall one said. "Quittin's a disease. Folks gotta see what it buys." They rode off, dragging their dust behind them like wedding veils. The day grew bigger without their noise. I hung and counted the long syllables of pain. Wind. Wire. Distant hooves that might have been thunder in the bones of the mesa. Sweat dripped into my eyes and made the world a smear of salt and glare. I thought about the things a man owes and the ones he pretends he doesn't. Somewhere under the cottonwood roots, water moved the slow way, cold as any church. I could hear it the way you hear your dead when the world finally shuts up. Time became a stretch of nothing, stitched to more nothing. The land narrowed to bark and rope and a hawk wheeling circles I couldn't read. Then a shadow cut the light. Not cloud, not vulture. 2 does with their ears up froze at the edge of the wash, then ghosted on. After them came a darker shape, closer to the ground, moving with the sound a whisper makes when it has teeth. She stepped into the thin shade, and the wind made a veil of her hair. Deer-hide dress scuffed by juniper, bow across her back, a hand axe at her hip. No noise I could name when she moved. Only a feeling, like the land had decided to lift a finger and say enough. She didn't look at my face first. She looked at the knots, at the height, at the ground beneath me pocked with the marks of other boots. She stepped where none of them had, where the roots made a ladder and the bark offered purchase. I felt the tree shiver with her weight. "I ain't your problem," I said, or tried to. The words came out like gravel. She said nothing. Steel flashed once. Rope fibers popped like dry grass seeds. The ground came up and hit me the way truth hits a liar fast, without apology. For a while I remembered only sky. Then a hand cool as creekstone pressed my temple and rolled me into shade. If you enjoy the story, hit that subscribe button right away. And if you don't, then just hit the like button anyway to keep more Wild West love stories coming. My eyes learned her in pieces. The thongs at her wrists, worn smooth by bow work. The pale scar above her left eyebrow, a crescent that had learned its lesson. The smell of crushed sage on her palms. She'd cut the noose clean, a single stroke. She watched the wash and the approach to it with a hunter's patience. When she finally spoke, it was to the wind, as if it were the only witness worth bothering. "They'll come back," she said. "They like to count." "Navajo?" I asked. It wasn't my business, but my mouth can be a fool. She weighed me with a look that wasn't a weapon, but could be used as one. "Ayanna," she said, "that is enough." I tried to sit, and the world hissed, white. She caught my shoulder with a firmness that was not kindness, only good sense. "Not yet," she said. "Breathe." So I did. The breath scraped at first, then it found a rhythm. Around us the mesquite clicked seed pods together like old women counting, and a red-tailed hawk wrote its slow gospel on the blue. She drank once from a rawhide water bag, then set it in my palm and closed my fingers over it. My hand made a fist around the neck of it like I didn't trust water to stay put. "Why?" I said. That word had more years on it than I did. "Because this is not their tree," she said. "And you are not theirs to hang." Her eyes went over me again, quick and thorough, and found the welt where rope had burned my leg. She tore a strip from the hem of her dress and bound it, tight as a promise kept. I wanted to say thank you, but the West makes a man sell words dear. I nodded instead. She nodded back. A broker who'd agreed to terms. We moved when the sun tipped a hair. She walked ahead and let the land swallow our tracks. I followed the way a man follows the last thread he's got. Her path threaded prickly pear, slid along the rock ribs, and vanished into a slit in the mesa I would have called a trick of shadow if I hadn't been led right into it. The air under that red stone was 10 degrees kinder. She left me in a pocket where the wind couldn't tell lies, and set about making a fire no bigger than a man's hand. I watched her work. Flint, dry grass, the will of someone who had nothing to prove to the world but had to prove something to the day. Heat came up soft. Smoke hugged the rock and refused to be seen. She poured water into a tin cup that had seen more miles than some men. When the first bubbles thought about being born, she dropped in leaves I didn't know, and a stem that smelled like clean rain. "Drink slow." She held it to my lip. I did. It tasted like the bottom of a canyon at dawn. "Name?" she said after a while. "Elias." I didn't add the last name the outlaws had nailed to the cottonwood for me. The past doesn't need invitations. She didn't ask for more. The land outside our slit went quieter, as if news had traveled. There were 2 lives hiding in it, and it didn't want to scare them off. My heartbeat, and the small sounds of her mending kit bone needle, sinew thread, cloth boiled into honesty, made a camp music of their own. "Those men," she said, testing a knot, "their brands don't belong here. They belong to the road." "They belong to me," I said, and a thing inside me tried to stand again. Or, I belonged to them. Until I didn't. "Of. You left their fire," she said, not a question. "I tried," I said. She sat back on her heels, the kind of rest that's learned from carrying burdens without witnesses. "Try again," she said. We stayed in the slit till the sun failed. She slept with one hand near the bow and the other under her head. I slept like a man who had fallen once from the sky and didn't trust it not to try again. Somewhere in the night, coyotes practiced their wicked hymn, and a freight of stars hauled memory across the vault. I counted what I owed, a life to her, debt to the land, the shape of an old rope in my calf and in my mind. By morning my body had accepted its bill. We moved before the wind remembered our names. Ayanna threaded the mesas to a secret ditch of green, where water made a silver seam, so narrow you'd miss it if you looked with eyes and not with thirst. There she set me to work quiet, work fit for a man half dead and half proud. Strip willow bark, clean a cut, boil cloth. She didn't say it was to keep me from counting ghosts. She didn't have to. "Your people," I said once. "They'll miss you. They will know where I am," she said. "If I do not return in 3 suns, they will come. For me? For what is missing," she said. "You, my water bag, the quiet of this canyon." She wasn't cruel. She was exact. It felt like mercy. When I slept that noon, I dreamed the cottonwood had grown hands and kept me. When I woke, Ayanna was gone. For the span of 10 heartbeats, I felt the old cold come back, the one that settles in a man who's run too long from the man he was. Then she returned, carrying 2 strips of something that had not survived meeting her arrow. "Eat," she said. "You will need your feet." Lo. I chewed and tasted the desert the way it tastes itself, salt, iron, smoke, and the stubborn sweetness of a thing that refuses not to be alive. The food made a heat in me that wasn't anger for once. I let it sit. "They'll come back to count," I said at last. "You said." "They will," she said, "and you will not be hanging when they do." "What then?" I asked, and hated the hope in it. She looked past me, into the notch of sky our slit of world allowed. "Then you decide if you are a man who keeps digging the same hole," she said, "or a man who fills one." The wind outside pressed its face to the stone, and listened. I listened with it. Firelight, care, and the enemy's shadow drawing near. Frontier gestures build trust. The moral fever rises. By dusk, the slit of stone had learned our names. The canyon wind stopped asking questions, and the small fire we made burned low, no taller than a man's thumb, because Ayana willed it so. She moved like someone taught by the earth itself, quiet, exact, with hands that spoke more than words ever could. She taught me the silence of doing things right. Lay the wood so the grain speaks the same way, let the smoke find its own breath, turn the pot until the boil talks soft. Even her shadow seemed disciplined. Under her hands the rough things of a life, tin, twine, a bent needle grew orderly. Under mine, they remembered their past. The canyon smelled of iron and sage. Somewhere high above, a raven called 3 times each, cry sharp as a nail driven into the dusk. I listened, counting the echoes the way a man counts the heartbeats of something fragile. I wanted to give her something I wasn't ashamed to have my name on. Work is a prayer when you can't say one, and I hadn't prayed in years. I took her bowstring between my fingers, rolled the ware flat with beeswax, and spliced what had frayed. I sanded my shame off a cooking spoon and put a new edge on it with riverstone until it shone like a small moon. I fixed a buckle on her strap and left my mark nowhere. "Good," she said at last, and that single word was a cathedral. We spoke little. Words are a kind of debt out here. You spend careful, or you end up broke. When we did speak, her sentences were cut to fit the day, short and unadorned, like arrows stripped of their fletching for close range. "Tracks," she said near dawn, her voice lower than the wind, and set her palm open to show me their size in air. "2 horses, heavy on the left fore. One man chews with his molars. He spits to the right. He will be the first to shoot. He leans." I stared at her hand, not the air. "How do you—" "Because men are the same men," she said, with no heat in it. "Only the hats change." Her calm scared me more than any gun ever could. She took me to a fold in the land where we could watch the entrance to our slit. The sun hadn't cleared the ridge yet. Light came in pieces, slow and stingy. She pressed 2 fingers against my ribs and moved me an inch. "Shadow," she said. "Your enemy is the Sunday." "My enemy's got a name," I said. "He nailed it to that tree." "Then the sun is his friend," she said, eyes never leaving the sand. "Make him lose one." We laced the path with small lies, loose shale to betray a weight, a dragged branch to scrape a shin, a harmless snake relocated to a patch of warmth where a boot would not expect life. Not to kill, to turn speed into clumsiness, to make men angry at the ground. Angry men shoot the sky. By noon, the ground told us the story we feared. They had been back. They had found the cut rope. One had laughed. Ayana read that in the scuff of his heel where he rocked back on it, pleased with the noise his throat had made. The other had pissed on my hat. She read that in the dark circle on the dust and the little chain of drops, a man who thinks himself king makes as he walks away. "They will return at dusk," she said. "Men like to walk into shadow proud." "We could leave," I said. "We could," she said, and put her hand flat on the rock between us, the way a woman puts her palm on a horse's neck to remind it of the world. "But the land is not a road to them. It is a cupboard. They will open it again." The fire cracked, tiny blue veins of flame breaking through the last of the mesquite. Heat brushed our faces, a mercy and a warning both. I watched her profile, the slope of her nose, the faint line of ash along her cheekbone where she had brushed the fire too close. I wanted to tell her she looked like a prayer carved in smoke, but the West has no language for that kind of truth. We built nothing that looked like a trap. We only let the country do its job. Wind, heat-stored stone, a bend of canyon where echoes fold wrong, and a man turns to answer himself. She showed me a ledge that felt solid until you looked at it with your weight on it, and the truth of it lived in the crack underneath. We left it for a boot with no respect. The day bled itself slowly. Light went the color of old pennies. My palms itched from waiting. I checked the Winchester, the one I'd once slept with like a body. I set it down, picked it up, set it down again. The past in my hands had teeth. Ayanna took the rifle from me and laid it across her knees. "You shoot like you talk," she said. "Careful, a good thing. But tonight you will need to choose when not to talk." "What am I supposed to hold instead?" I asked. She touched the air between my ribs with 2 fingers again, the place a rope had burned. "Hold this," she said, "so you remember how breath works when fear takes it." Dusk slid in like a thief, gold fading to copper, copper to blood. The canyon cooled, and the air turned heavy with the smell of juniper and something older, gun oil maybe, or memory. They came as predicted, men who thought dusk was a blanket with their names on it. The first took the ledge. It argued with him. The second laughed and stepped where laughter had told him to. He found the shale and gave it his heel the way a child kicks a door to hear it. The canyon threw his own noise back at him, louder, and he turned his head to answer, showing the soft place under his jaw to whatever God had patience for him. Ayanna's arrow made a whisper of it. He went down without ceremony, a sack of parts delivered to dirt. "Leave him," she said when my legs twitched toward the fallen. "The living are louder." The first man had found patience, or a bird's idea of it. He stepped careful now. That made him slower. His shadow got there a breath before he did. I shot the shadow. Rock spat. He flinched and put his foot where we'd asked. The ledge wrote his name in red stone and gravity. He fell into the place echoes go to practice. He didn't bounce. It was quiet as a quarrel settled by 2 men who remember their fathers. In that quiet I felt something try to grow in me that I hadn't watered in a long time. Not pride, not relief. Something smaller and more expensive. "They won't come in 2s next time," I said. "No," she said. "They will come in hunger." We moved before hunger learned. We were chewable. Night made the land kind in cruel ways, cool air, clear sound and cruel in kind ways, every shadow a door. We walked in single file, her first, me following the rhythm of her steps. Soft heel, whisper toe, pause. The stars came slow, 1 coin at a time spilled from God's old purse. Ayanna found us a pocket under stone with a crack that let the stars drip in one by one. I bound her wrist where the bowstring had kissed it open. Her skin was warm, taut under the dirt, and the smell of cedar smoke lingered in her hair. She told me where to press, where to knot, where to leave room for blood to remember its roots. "You have done this before," she said. "I've unhurt men. I hurt first," I said. "It's different, but hands remember the body, even if the soul doesn't want to." She watched my face the way you watch weather. "You talk like a preacher who lost his Bible," she said. "I lost something," I said. "Could be that." For a long while, neither of us moved. The fire had died, but the stone still held its heat. I felt her breath even out beside me, steady as the land itself. The wind shifted and carried the smell of rain from far away. A lie, probably, but a gentle one. Sleep found us because we didn't invite it. Just before I went under, she said, "Tomorrow we go where the wind forgets its own path. You will dig there." "For what?" I asked, already knowing. "For 2 holes," she said. "One for what you have carried, one for what you do not want to carry any longer." I dreamed a cottonwood with wrists. I woke with dirt under my nails I didn't remember earning. The fire had gone to ash, the stars to smoke, and the silence between us felt almost like peace. If you like Wild West love stories or Wild West stories, drop a bunch of 1 second and your place in the comments for the Wild West Love channel. Tell me where you're listening from so I don't feel so alone out here. The 2 graves. Confession. Ayanna's calm philosophy. She saved him to let him choose how his past dies. We walked into a country with fewer names than scars. The rock went white as bone, and the wind lost the joke it was telling. The land had no mercy left in it, only patience. Every few miles the color changed from rust to chalk, from chalk to gray, as if the desert was teaching me how to forget in layers. Ayanna set her palm to the earth and listened with it. Her fingers spread wide like roots, remembering water. "Here," she said at last, and the word had the same weight as when folks say amen for the last time. I dug with a short-handled shovel that had cut more fence post holes than graves, but ground is ground, and a hole is a hole until you declare it otherwise. Sweat made a map on my shirt. My breath came hard, the way it does when a man's heart outruns his reason. Blisters opened like old grudges, soft and red and full of memory. The earth smelled of salt and iron, like blood had been training it to remember men. The first hole came easier, shallow, the size of a box you could carry alone. I laid the rope I'd cut from my ankle in it. My colt, the one called a peacemaker by men who never asked peace what it wanted. A little roll of greenbacks with more blood than ink on them. A deputy star I hadn't earned, only worn. I set each thing down like I was teaching it a new table prayer and covered it with dirt. The sound of the shovel was soft, like someone closing a Bible halfway through the sermon. The second hole took my breath because it asked for it. It was longer, deeper. As if the ground herself had said, "If you mean to stop what you are thinking, then do not do it halfway." I stood in it, knee-deep, then hip, then rib. The walls smelled of a summer that never came, damp and strange, as though the earth still held someone else's promise in its ribs. When I climbed out, the wind had turned and the sky had decided on a darker blue, the color a man's eyes take when they've seen too much. Ayanna stood at the foot of the pit and looked down into it as if the land had coughed up a story it was tired of keeping. Her hair caught the light like black glass, her face steady, unreadable. I started and stopped. "Some things don't like to be spoken in air. That you would put me there," she said, not unkind. My mouth went dry. "I thought I was saving you from a worse box." "You were saving yourself from a worse mirror," she said. "The kind of man who calls murder mercy and says it fast so he does not hear himself." The words didn't strike, they settled, like dust on a wound. I couldn't look at her. The hole looked back the way water looks at a man who thinks he can walk it. Truth is a mean friend. It shows up and doesn't bring supper. "When I cut you down," she said, "I knew men would follow. I knew death would look at me and try my name in its mouth. I do not save to be safe. I save to give choice back to breath." I found a laugh that wasn't one. "Choice?" I said. "Out here?" "Out here is the only place it lives," she said. "In town they trade it for tin and whiskey." The sun burned a hole through the silence. Her shadow fell across my boots, thin but unbroken. I had nothing worth saying. She stepped close enough that I could smell the sage again. The faint sweetness of dust and skin, warmed by Sunday. The nearness of her made time feel slower, older, as if the world had been waiting for this exact distance between two souls. "If you mean to bury something living," she said, "let it be what taught your hands to lift that shovel for the wrong work." Her voice didn't rise or soften. It just was, same as a river's voice when it decides where to go. She put her hand on my chest, as if searching for a heartbeat she would allow to continue. "And if you mean to bury me," she said, "then use the right words for it. Do not take from me the honor of my death, but do not pretend it belongs to mercy." The wind went quiet the way a room does when men take their hats off. I looked at the hole until it looked like me, the edges blurred in the heat, trembling, ready to swallow whatever I was foolish enough to call truth. Then I backfilled it, slow, one shovel at a time, no speeches. Dirt thudded and leveled and forgot. When I was done, the ground wore only a new seam, quick to fade. Ayanna watched until the last spadeful lay down flat. She nodded once, as if a price had been named and paid. "They will come soon," she said. "Hunger, like I told you, and shame rides behind it." I wiped the back of my hand across my mouth and tasted metal. "You stay behind me," I said. "No," she said. "I stand with you. Side is where we belong." It sounded like a vow made without ceremony. The kind that lasts longer because it doesn't need one. We set the mesa for a lesson. Not for them, for me. Where to kneel, where to spare, where to end. The sun climbed to its cruelest. It looked the way truth does with a badge on. I took my place in its light and felt my shadow go small and honest. Ayanna loosened 3 shafts from her quiver and held them like prayers she meant to aim. I watched her face as she listened to the land, chin lifted, eyes half closed, every muscle ready. The bow in her hand curved like a promise kept under pressure. My rifle rested in the dust beside me, barrel catching the glare. And for once I didn't think of it as a tool, but as a relic of who I'd been before her. Calm reached me. When the riders came, they came wrong. Spurred hard, mouths open, eyes fed on what they imagined, and not on what the ground told them. The lead man carried my name as a toy. He dragged it behind his horse to make his dust look bigger. Men like that cannot smell rain. The noise reached us first, the kind of thunder that's man-made and cruel. Bridles clanked, hooves tore at the crusted soil. Laughter scattered across the canyon like coins in a church offering. They thought the world was still theirs. We let them get inside the echo. Then the day went to work. The canyon tightened its throat. The sound folded back on itself. Ayanna's first arrow whispered death like it was returning a debt. The second found the man who had worn my name wrong. He jerked once, arms wide, like a scarecrow greeting the wind, then folded into the dust. The third arrow missed on purpose, a warning to whatever heavens still kept score. Gunfire bloomed, sharp and metallic. I fired twice not to kill, but to turn their courage into confusion. Bullets struck rock and screamed, ricocheted like caged hawks. One horse went down, another reared and split from its rider. The smell of gunpowder mixed with sun and sweat. It was the same perfume every man wears when the past catches him. The fight didn't last long. The mesa decided who belonged. Dust settled, soft as snow in a dream no one wakes from. The dead lay crooked but still, as if finally understanding stillness. When it was over, I lowered the rifle. Ayanna stood beside me, her hair pulled by the wind, eyes fixed on the horizon where the earth bled into the sky. She didn't smile. She didn't need to. "This place remembers," she said. "So do I answered. She looked at me then, not through me, but into me the way fire looks at wood before deciding whether to spare it. "Then it is done," she said quietly. 2 graves both filled. The wind moved again, lighter now, as if the land had exhaled. Far off, a raven circled, its cry torn thin by distance. I watched it go, black against the clean blue, and thought maybe some ghosts don't want to haunt forever. Ayanna started walking, slow, sure-footed, toward the line where light turned red and gold again. I followed, 1 pace behind, until the shadows stretched long enough to meet. The earth under our boots was soft from fresh disturbance, but the air ahead smelled of something unbroken. We left the mesa without looking back. The West doesn't reward looking back. And somewhere between her steps and mine, between the graves that weren't graves and the names we'd stopped carrying, I realized what she'd meant all along. She hadn't saved me from death. She'd saved me for life. "Hey there, friend, take a moment and get yourself a full glass of water. Your body will thank you." Noon shootout. The turn. Past dies in daylight. A different freedom cracks open. They stopped too close because pride always leans on the reins. The heat around them shimmered like water, pretending to be mercy. Dust rose, then hung in the air, waiting to learn which direction honor would fall. The lead man, Macklin, once grinned with that thin part of the mouth only snakes like. He held up something on a thong, my old badge. The tin flashed mean, bright as a lie that's been polished too often. "You forgot this," he said, "and your backbone." "I'm returning both," I said, letting my hands hang away from the gun he wanted me chained to. My fingers twitched once, not from fear but memory. Ayanna stood 3 steps to my left, half in sun, half saved for later. The line of her shoulders drew a quiet law through the space between us. I felt her there the way a man feels the pull on a mule team, steady, invisible, exact. She didn't look at me. She looked at the wind and told it how to spend itself. The heat beat down like judgment. Every sound was sharp, the creak of leather, the slow shift of a hoof, a fly's small ambition. "You could have died quiet," Macklin said, spreading his arms like a preacher who loved himself too much. But you ran to the rocks and learned prayer from a heathen. That's not a good look on you, Eli. You taught me the bad looks, I said. I'm here to return them. Liver. His grin faltered, a crack across the varnish. He had 3 men with him, who would have been better alone, each waiting for the other to start the mistake. The 4th man, the one with the left lean saddle Ayanna had called before she even saw him, kept chewing his jaw like it owed him rent. You going to draw? Macklin said. Or do I shoot the apprentice first? Ayanna spoke, low. Don't eat with your teeth, she said, in his direction, so gently he flinched. Eat with your eyes. Then, he blinked, offended by a woman who sounded like rain correcting dust. He looked straight at her and forgot to see the ledge he had stopped under, the ledge whose long crack held sun-heated air thirsty to go somewhere. I put a single round into the crack. The hot breath above him turned to stone lace and came down with a hum. Not a rockfall, a lesson. It shaved his hat brim, bit his horse, and drove them both backward into the second man's panic. Horses talking to each other in fear, Trump men talking to themselves in greed. Ayanna's first arrow stitched the talk shut. The second pinned a sleeve to a saddle without asking the arm to join it. The third went wide on purpose and sang along the Colt barrel in Macklin's hand so the iron would remember it could burn without firing. The air turned white with sound, metal, breath, heartbeat. The horses backed, nostrils flared, eyes wide as moons too close to the earth. Macklin steadied himself, shoulders tightening, and spat the dust from his mouth. You ain't righteous, he said, suddenly small where daylight remembered its job. You ain't nothing but a fence fixer with a bad memory. I remember enough, I said. I remember you like women hanging. I remember you pay boys to do the tying. I remember my signature on pay chits that bought rope. I took one step and let the sun own me. The badge in his hand winked once, as if ashamed of what it had witnessed. I dug a grave this morning. It wasn't for the woman you came to break. It was for the part of me you hired. He spat again and found he had no spit left. His tongue stuck to truth. You always talked like a dime novel, he said, trying for humor and finding none. I'm trying to learn shorter words, I said, and shot. It wasn't a pretty shot. It was a farm shot, close, necessary, aimed at the place a man keeps for standing. The report cracked flat, no echo. He dropped. The other 2 found suddenly that the West had gotten big again, and they were too small for it. One ran a horse into a saguaro, whose arms had no sense of humor. The cactus held him long enough for regret. The other looked at Ayanna the way a lost child checks a mother's face for mercy, and found none he had earned. He let the gun go and put both hands in air, like a man measuring rain. She nodded him toward the open, and he took it, happier to meet exile than justice. Silence stayed a while, then thinned. The world smelled of gun oil and sun-cooked fear. I walked to Macklin. He tried to make his mouth into a law. The words came out like a boy's. We were the same, he said, as if it were comfort. We were, I said. I'm sorry for that. He put his hand to his ribs and found truth there with his fingers. She saved you, he said. A last poison. She gave me back my vote, I said. He laughed. Died, or both. The sound was small, almost polite. The sun did what it always does after such things, it went on shining, indifferent as God when he's letting men practice. Heat shimmered where bodies had been. Buzzards hadn't seen it yet. Even the wind seemed to wait for permission to move again. We burned the rope ends we found. We buried no tin. Tin earns no ground. We covered what blood we could, and left the rest to ants who are honest and priests who are not. When it was done, I took the badge from the thong and set it on a rock where the wind could think about it. 2 graves, I said to Ayanna. She looked at the sky, eyes reflecting the blue that had forgiven nothing. 2, she said, and one for language that made you less. Her words settled deep. Some things die in daylight better than in dark. We walked from that place to the canyon where the elders sometimes listened to news. The desert breathed again, slow and dusty, like a chest after grief. Behind us, flies began their small sermons. As we went, I told the land what I had done. It did not answer, which was right. The land has heard enough confessions to know better than to talk back. Ayanna spoke a while in her own tongue, soft and rhythmic, like the wind learning manners. The day changed key, shadows stretched, the air cooled into meaning. I didn't ask for a translation. Some songs are not for you. You can still sit close. And when we reached the edge of the mesa, where the world fell away into gold and distance, she turned to me just once. "The past dies in daylight," she said. "Don't call it back at night." I nodded, feeling the sun on my face heavy, clean, merciless, and for the first time in years, it didn't feel like judgment. It felt like breath. If you're watching on TV, don't hesitate, grab your phone and hit subscribe to my channel so you'll never miss out on our amazing characters. Open horizon. 2 graves behind. Not burial of her, but of his old self. Home is a direction, not a place. Canyon de Chelly took us the way a mother takes back a child she never held without fuss, with a gravity that made talking rude. Sandstone rose like the backs of sleeping giants. Cottonwoods found their green and hummed. In the shade, elders listened. In the light, children practiced not staring at me. Ayanna spoke for a time that felt like rain length. The old men nodded in a way that wasn't agreement so much as acceptance that the day had happened and would be counted. An old woman came and put her palm on my chest, where Ayanna had measured breath. She did not say I was good. She did not say I could stay. She said, "Eat," and handed me a bowl with corn and a meat whose name I did not ask for. I ate. The bowl was a round truth my hands understood. When we camped outside the canyon that night, the stars wore their quiet like new clothes. Ayanna drew a line in the dust between us with the end of a twig, not a wall. A gift of choice. "So you can sleep," she said. "So you can cross it if you choose, and not because fear pushes." I looked at that line longer than a man should look at dirt. Then I lay down on my side of a world that had room for both breathing. At dawn, we, where the 2 graves had been, because the story wanted its last look. The mound that held rope and tin had sagged into the shape of peace. The other was flat, a scar already memorized by the wind. I stood there with my hat in my hands and the old impulse to confess itching like a healing cut. "I'm not a good man," I said. She lifted a shoulder the way a mountain might shrug off fog. "The land doesn't keep score. It keeps tracks. You can make new ones." I set my hat back on. The wind paid us no mind. A raven made a sound like an old hinge. We turned our faces toward a country with fewer fences and more work. Not the kind that pays in tin. The kind that builds a home you carry in your ribs. We did not say where we would end. We said what the next hour needed. Water, shade by noon, a place to mend a strap. When the sun tilted, she handed me the bow and I returned it waxed and honest. When the fire settled to its red thinking, I put coffee on and didn't sweeten it with lies. On a ridge where evening went to polish its coins, she said, "You will always have 2 holes with you, one for what turns heavy when you remember it, one for what tries to take your breath again." "I'll keep a shovel," I said. "Keep a hand," she said, and let hers find mine over the line in the dust we had left behind us that morning. We walked on. The horizon didn't get closer, but it didn't need to. It was enough that it existed and we were pointed at it. In the middle of that wide-blown quiet, if you've made it this far, I know you're a true fan of WWL. From the bottom of my heart, I wish your day is filled with health and happiness, and may a little stroke of luck find you in the next 15 minutes. Don't forget to share it with me in the comments. The West kept its counsel. We kept ours. Somewhere behind us, a cottonwood stood with no rope on it. Somewhere ahead, a cabin waited that neither of us owned yet. We would build it out of small gestures. Water handed, fire tended. A fence set not to keep a person out, but to keep a promise in. That is how cowboy love stories earn their name. Not with speeches, with work. And if anyone asked later what became of the man nailed to a tree and the woman who cut him free, they could say this: they chose to stay human where the land had asked them to be less. That's all the miracle I ever needed. In the glow of that thought, the dusk felt like a door opening. We stepped through. Wild West love isn't a place on any map. It's the distance you're willing to walk beside another breathing thing without putting a rope on it. If you carry that with you long enough, even a man like me can learn a different kind of freedom. At the edge of the night, I heard myself say a prayer that didn't know it was one. Maybe God heard. Maybe only the wind did. Both are fine. Cowboy love stories. Wild West love. Wild West love story. They're not fairy tales. They're two hands building a table where both can eat and neither bows. Today's story is about pains that seemed to have no way out until a small ray of light changed everything. Do you believe that, even in the darkest times, there's always a miracle waiting at the end of the road? And if deep down you still believe that God is watching over you, quietly arranging everything, then right now, leave a comment, AMEN, below this video. Because who knows, at the very moment you write it, a blessing may quietly find its way into your life.